Hello, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Moore's October Rants. Today's episode is going to be titled Parental Hypocrisy. Parents, from the earliest days of our lives, are our first teachers. They instill values, set rules, and aim to guide us toward becoming better versions of ourselves. It's often with their best intentions that they establish themselves as the moral compass we're expected to follow. But as we grow older, a sobering realization begins to take shape. Some of the very people who teach us these values don't always live by them. Hypocrisy, especially in parenthood, isn't an anomaly. It's a recurring theme. And let's be clear from the outset. This doesn't apply to every parent. Each individual is unique, and many parents genuinely practice what they preach. Still, the pattern is common enough to warrant discussion. Even legendary comedian George Carlin touched on this dynamic, capturing the strange contradiction with his signature clarity. He suggested that hypocrisy comes with the job, and in many ways, he wasn't wrong. The parental role, by its nature, lends itself to authority, and with authority comes the temptation to make exceptions for oneself. Children are taught to listen, to obey. If a parent says, "Be quiet," the child naturally assumes that silence is expected, and not just expected, but required. Yet the moment that same parent ignores the expectation they set, talking loudly in inappropriate settings and dismissing others who request the same courtesy, the contradiction becomes glaring. This behavior doesn't vanish as the child matures. In fact, it often intensifies. Even into adulthood, many parents continue to enforce arbitrary rules or criticize behaviors that they themselves exhibit. The cognitive dissonance is frustrating, not just because it's unfair, but because it's confusing. It sends a mixed message. Do as I say, not as I do. That, in its rawest form, is hypocrisy. And when it comes from someone you love, look up to, and maybe even fear disappointing, it can be deeply unsettling. It's important to emphasize this truth. Hypocrisy is learned. It's not embedded in our DNA. It's a behavior we absorb, often unconsciously, through years of modeled inconsistency. When you're raised by someone who says one thing but routinely does another, you might begin to internalize that behavior without realizing it. It doesn't end at the surface level. You may not think you've inherited their contradictions, but deep down, patterns take root. You might tell yourself, "I'll never be like them," while unknowingly replicating the very dynamics you once resented. That's why it's so critical to break the cycle. The beauty of self-awareness and freedom is that we aren't bound by our upbringing. We can choose to be different, better, more intentional, more aligned. We can raise children who trust us not just for our words, but for our integrity. But the first step is recognition. It requires examining ourselves and, more challengingly, confronting the ones who raised us. Calling out hypocrisy, especially when it's directed toward us or others, isn't easy, particularly when we're taught from an early age that parents are to be respected, not challenged. Still, respectful confrontation is necessary. Conversations need to happen, and they need to be fair. If a parent sets a rule they won't follow, we have the right, and perhaps even the responsibility, to point it out. Without confrontation, unhealthy cycles persist. With it, there's at least a chance for clarity and change. Another harsh truth? Many parents aren't quick to admit they're wrong. There's a certain resistance that comes with the parent label. Some feel that their role grants them authority, absolute and unchallenged. And when authority becomes synonymous with infallibility, honest communication becomes impossible. This resistance often leads to emotional distance. Countless people reflect on why they've moved away from their parents, not out of resentment, but preservation. When conversations are one-sided and maturity is not met with mutual respect, sometimes the healthiest choice is physical and emotional distance. Because even as adults, we're often seen as children. That perception doesn't vanish with age. If a parent refuses to grow with us, to update their view of us, then they aren't truly engaging with who we are. They're holding on to who they think we were. Sometimes, that means we have to become the parent in the room. When immaturity guides their actions and they refuse to learn from mistakes, we become the stable force they once aimed to be. It's uncomfortable, even tragic, but it's a scenario many find themselves facing. Once again, this isn't about painting all parents with the same brush. There are extraordinary parents who live with integrity, who admit mistakes, and who raise children with humility and honesty. But there's power in acknowledging that those stories aren't everyone's stories. Generalizations are dangerous, but so is silence. It's important to name what exists, even if it doesn't define every parent, because the pattern is still far too prevalent, and we can't ignore the gaslighting that sometimes emerges in these dynamics. When we call out the inconsistency and they spin the narrative, making us question our perception or feel guilty for speaking up. That's manipulation. That's not love. That's deflection. There's a saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's not a statement reserved for politics. It applies here too. When parents wield power without checks, without openness, and without reflection, they become susceptible to the same flaws they punish in others. But maybe, just maybe, there's a hidden gift in all this. When you see what you don't want to be, it clarifies what you do want to become. Every contradiction, every unfair expectation, becomes a signpost pointing toward the kind of parent or person you hope to be instead. Life is about balance. We'll all meet hypocrites. Some of us were raised by them, but we don't have to become what we observed. We can interrupt the pattern. We can choose reason, authenticity, and emotional accountability. It's even more nuanced when hypocrisy shows up in extreme or subtle ways. One parent might scream at you to be quiet while being the loudest voice in the room. Another might ridicule you for swearing while regularly doing it themselves, dismissing it as different when it comes from them. Some will speak disrespectfully and then demand you treat them with unwavering politeness. And if you mirror their energy, you're the one in the wrong. That double standard isn't just unfair, it's damaging. And yes, some lie. Blatantly. Repeatedly. Not all of them, but enough to notice. Enough to disrupt peace. Enough to fracture relationships, especially when the lies are used to maintain power or avoid accountability. In those cases, distance becomes not just a choice, but a survival strategy. You deserve emotional safety. You deserve consistency. Some of us try to fix our parents. We believe that through enough conversation, patience, or time, we can open their eyes, but often we can't. Especially when ego outweighs empathy and age is mistaken for superiority. The unfortunate truth is that ego and control run deep. Some parents don't want to change because they see change as surrendering control to someone they raised, and that dynamic threatens their perception of authority. In rare cases, one parent will recognize the harm the other is causing and intervene. When power is equal, that confrontation holds more weight. But when it comes from the child, even the adult child, it's often dismissed. The dynamic is too ingrained to be easily rewritten. And if that hypocrisy goes unaddressed, it can eat away at families. It fractures trust. It creates resentment. Sometimes, it even burns bridges that never quite get rebuilt. Still, the greatest hope is this. Hypocrisy may be learned, but it can be unlearned. You are not doomed to repeat what raised you. You can model better, choose differently, teach openly, practice what you preach. And if you ever forget what that looks like, remember the words of a certain YouTuber who often ends his videos with a simple but resonant reminder. Be logical, be reasonable, and have fun. This is how I'm going to end it, by saying exactly that. Anyways, thank you for listening to this episode of the Moore's October Rants. Signing out. Have a good one, guys. Goodbye.